Hello everyone, welcome back to another GCSE History exam technique tutorial. Today we are going to focus on evaluating interpretations. That's on paper 3, your Germany paper, and we're going to go over some of the content around the rise of Hitler 1929 to 1933. Okay, so let's recap reasons why the Nazis increased their support between 1929 and 1932. There are lots of reasons for this, but first, let's look at the strengths of the Nazis themselves. Firstly, Hitler had certain qualities that gave the Nazis an advantage. He was a strong leader, very charismatic, and an excellent speaker. This allowed him to win over audiences and give them hope. And his strong leadership really appealed to Germans who saw democracy as weak and wanted a strong government. Secondly, the Nazis were excellent at propaganda. They used posters focused on Hitler, very simple slogans, modern technology such as airplanes and slideshows, and they also put on fantastic rallies. This propaganda made Hitler and the Nazis look very strong and impressive. And Hitler was also able to fly across Germany, campaigning and speaking in the election campaigns of the early 1930s. Thirdly, the Nazis reorganised themselves in the later years of the 1920s. Hitler set up departments, local branches across the country, and each one was led by a Gauleiter. This made the Nazis look very organised, capable and efficient. And those local branches were very important during the election campaigns because they carried out very effective campaigning, for instance, leafleting. Fourthly, the Nazis' promises. They promised a huge variety of things to the German public. They were very flexible about their promises and they dropped policies which were unpopular. And where all else failed, they simply made vague promises like making Germany great again. This is important because it allowed them to appeal to a broad range of groups across German society, including middle class, working class, farmers, businessmen, women, and young people. And last but not least, the Nazis' Sturmabteilung, the SA. They were uniformed and they protected Nazi speakers and interrupted other party meetings. They also beat up communists. This was crucial to the Nazis' success. It allowed them to disrupt other parties' campaigns, it made the Nazis look disciplined and powerful, and it also gave them a reputation as being really tough on communism. Now let's move away from the strengths of the Nazis and look at other reasons why Nazi support increased. Firstly, the Depression hit Germany after 1929. Businesses closed, unemployment soared, and farmers fell into debt. This caused a lot of poverty, suffering and hopelessness. And as people felt increasingly desperate, they turned to radical groups, including the Nazis and the Communists. Secondly, the Communist Party themselves. They won increasing support from the German working class, especially when the Depression began. This worried the middle classes, the industrialists and the wealthy people in German society, who feared what the Communists might do if they took power. This only made the Nazis more attractive, as they were seen as tough on communism. And thirdly, the moderate parties. They disagreed over how to solve the Depression. Instead of working together, the coalition between the Centre Party and the Social Democrats fell apart. The Chancellor, Brüning, he was from the Centre Party, he had to fall back on using Article 48 to make law without the permission of the Reichstag. He actually did this 66 times. All of this damaged the reputation of democracy. To many Germans, democracy looked too weak to cope with the economic crisis. And it reinforced the idea that Germany would be better off with a stronger government. And lastly, the industrialists, such as Benz and Krupps. These were businessmen who donated huge amounts of money to the Nazis, largely because they were frightened of the Communist Party and wanted the Nazis to destroy them. This was important because this funding allowed the Nazis to afford their propaganda and their election campaigns. So why was Hitler made Chancellor in January 1933? Well, we know that the Nazis increased their support in the elections And we've seen that by July 1932, the Nazis had become the biggest party in the Reichstag. They had won 38% of votes. That means they won 230 seats. But Hitler doesn't get chosen as Chancellor until January of 1933, when Hindenburg chooses him and makes von Papen his vice. So what actually happened between these two events? Well, for that, we need to keep an eye on three individuals. Firstly, President Hindenburg, who actually hated Hitler. Secondly, von Papen from the Centre Party. And thirdly, von Schleicher, an army general. So let's fill in the gaps in our story and see how the actions of other people helped Hitler to become Chancellor. So the Nazis became the biggest party in the Reichstag in July 1932. Hindenburg still wouldn't choose Hitler as Chancellor. Instead, von Papen tried to stay on as Chancellor with the support of von Schleicher. But von Papen really struggled because he didn't have a majority in the Reichstag. Then in November, there were new elections held, and the Nazis actually dropped to 196 seats. They were still the biggest party in the Reichstag, but not quite as big as they had been before. Then in December 1932, von Schleicher stopped supporting von Papen as Chancellor, and instead persuaded Hindenburg to make him Chancellor instead. Von Papen and so determined to return to power. He approached Hitler and made a deal with him. Von Papen then warned Hindenburg that von Schleicher was planning a coup. He persuaded Hindenburg to choose Hitler as Chancellor, believing that Hitler could be controlled by limiting the number of Nazis in the government. Hitler would become the Chancellor and would be allowed only 2 other Nazis in the government. In January 1933, Hindenburg agreed. He chose Hitler as Chancellor and von Papen as vice. So let's have a look at an evaluating interpretations question on this. Here's what one looks like, and here's what to expect. The question will give you an issue to focus on. You'll be given 2 written interpretations, and they'll have a different view or emphasis about the issue. And you'll be asked how far you agree with one of the interpretations. So step by step, let's look at what to do. First of all, highlight the topic of the question and focus on it really closely in your answer. In this case, we've been asked about Hitler's rise to power. Then, annotate the interpretations by picking 2 or 3 points or language which the historian has used that you can build on, support or challenge, and I'll show you how to do that in a moment. Then take interpretation 1, support it with your own knowledge, and challenge it or show its weaknesses. Repeat that with interpretation 2. And finally, write a conclusion with a clear decision, which one do you agree with most, and your reasons why. So let's demonstrate how this works. We're going to take interpretation 1 and evaluate it. We're going to support the interpretation, and in a moment I'll show you how to challenge it. To support the interpretation, I'm going to try and draw out 3 details from the interpretation and develop them with my own knowledge. So the first thing I'm going to pick out is this bit here. The interpretation says the Depression caused economic problems like unemployment. Now I can support that with some of my own knowledge, because I know that unemployment reached 5 million by 1932. The interpretation also says moderate parties could not work together to deal with the problem. And I know I can develop that a little. I know the Social Democrats stopped working with Chancellor Brüning, and he had to fall back on using Article 48 to get his laws passed. Lastly, I'm going to pick up on this bit. The interpretation claims that the Depression increased support for the Nazis. Well, I can develop that a little. I know that the Nazi Party won 230 seats in the Reichstag in the 1932 election. So I've supported the interpretation with my own knowledge. So now that we've supported the interpretation, let's challenge it. That can be difficult to do, so I'm going to try and show you 2 ways of approaching that. When we're challenging interpretations, the first thing we might look for is exaggeration. That means, does the interpretation place too much emphasis on something, maybe exaggerating or overstating its importance? The second thing we might look for is omission. This means, does the interpretation fully address the topic, or are there important aspects which have been left out? Now I'm going to model both of these for you. So first of all, let's think about exaggeration. In this particular case, the historian puts a lot of emphasis on the Depression. Look, the historian begins by mentioning the Depression and going on to explain how it increased support for the Nazis. Now, although I agree that that's true, I think the historians exaggerated that a little bit. In actual fact, it wasn't just the Depression which increased support for the Nazis. The Nazis also had strengths of their own, which attracted voters. So look, I'm going to point out that exaggeration to my reader. I think interpretation 1 puts too much emphasis on the role of the Depression in bringing Hitler to power. We know that voters did become more attracted to radical parties when the Depression began, but the Nazis were also attractive because of their strengths, like their organisation and Hitler's leadership. It wasn't just because of the economic crisis. I think the historians over-exaggerated it here. The second thing we can look for is omission. Important aspects which the historian has left out. Now actually I think there is an important aspect which is missing here. Look down here. The historian says that the Nazis became the biggest party in the Reichstag and then they gave Hitler power. Well, that's true, but I think the historian's missing something out. He hasn't mentioned anything about the power struggle between von Papen and von Schleicher, or how and why Hindenburg was persuaded to make Hitler Chancellor. I think that's a big piece of the puzzle which is missing here. So look, interpretation 1 does not explain how Hitler became Chancellor. It tells us how the Nazis won seats in the Reichstag, but that was not enough to make Hitler Chancellor. He had to be chosen by Hindenburg for the position, and this was not guaranteed to happen, as Hindenburg did not even like Hitler. Von Papen's rivalry with Schleicher helped Hitler get the Chancellor's job. Interpretation 1 has left out a key point here, so it doesn't completely answer our question. Now, if we put both the support and the challenge part of our answer together, we have the first half of our answer. Look, here it is. There are 3 things going on here. We identify the strengths of the interpretation, we identify the weaknesses of the interpretation, and in both cases we support with our own knowledge. You might want to pause the video here and see if you can spot these things going on. And here they are. Now let's do exactly the same for interpretation 2. We'll start by supporting the interpretation. We're going to pick 2 details in it that we can develop with our own knowledge. I'm going to go for this one first. The interpretation says von Papen was determined to regain power. And I know that's correct, because von Papen had lost his majority in the Reichstag and he'd lost his position as Chancellor, which was taken by von Schleicher. Von Papen was determined to regain that. Secondly, I'm going to pick up this bit. Von Papen said he could control Hitler. And I know that that's true. Von Papen persuaded Hindenburg that Hitler could be controlled by allowing only 2 other Nazis in the government. Now let's try to challenge the interpretation. Remember, we're going to look for 2 things. We're going to look for either exaggeration or omission. In this case, I think I found some omission. I think the historian has left out some really important aspects. For example, look here. The historian says that von Papen met Hitler and agreed that Hitler would lead a government. Now I know it's true that von Papen struck a deal with Hitler, but our historian hasn't really explained to us why von Papen chose to make a deal with Hitler. What was it that Hitler had that made von Papen reach a deal with him? So I'm going to criticise the interpretation for this. Interpretation 2 does not tell us why von Papen approached Hitler to lead a government. We know the reason for this was because Hitler and the Nazis had more seats in the Reichstag than any other party, which was mentioned in Interpretation 1. So that made Hitler very useful to von Papen. Together, they had enough seats in the Reichstag to form a government. Interpretation 2 does not explain that directly. Okay, let's put everything together now to complete the second half of our answer. We've identified the strengths of Interpretation 2, we've identified its weaknesses, and in both cases we've used our own knowledge. Can you see these things happening in the answer? Pause now and have a look. And here they are. Now, although you don't need an intro for this style of question, you do need a conclusion. So here's a model conclusion. You might want to pause now, read it, and think about what's happening at each stage. Firstly, I've made a very clear judgment about which interpretation I think is better. In my case, I've gone for Interpretation 2. I still need to show that I can see the other side though, so I've tried to point out some of the advantages of Interpretation 1. However, at the end of my conclusion, I've tried to explain why, in the end, I went for Interpretation 2. What are my reasons for that? If you'd like to get some more practice at this, then think about this question. How far do you agree with Interpretation 1 about the challenges facing the Weimar Republic in the years 1919 to 1923? If you'd like to have a go at this, here's Interpretation 1. And remember, I want you to try and think about doing two things. First of all, support the interpretation, and then try to challenge it. And here's Interpretation 2 for that question. Again, try to support it, and then try to challenge it. Thanks for watching, everybody. Don't forget to check out the YouTube channel for more great videos. And don't forget to subscribe.